March 3rd, 1888. The Wind River Range. The wind wasn't howling. It was screaming with a voice of shattered glass, a sound that didn't just push against the ears but scraped against the soul. And Anya found herself alone, the tracks of her husband's partners already vanishing into the white fury, their final words, cargo, not crew, frozen in the air like a curse she was meant to die under. The moraine around her was a jagged tomb of ancient ice and stone, a chaotic landscape spat out by the glacier's slow, indifferent hunger, and every exposed surface was already sheathed in a lethal, glittering rime, because the temperature was plunging toward a point where spit would crackle before it hit the ground. And the last warmth she would ever feel was the fading heat of her own betrayal. She had been deemed expendable ballast, a widow's weight slowing the profit of strong men. And so they had taken the tent, the bulk of the provisions, and the dogs, leaving her with a knife, a tin cup, and the clothes that were already stiffening on her body. A decision made with the cold calculus of gold fever that viewed a human life as less than the gear that sustained it. The storm was not merely weather. It was an active, malevolent force, hunting for the heat of her blood. A roaring white entity that sought out every gap in her woolens with needle-sharp teeth. And it would find her long before any search party might think to look. Because those men would report an accident, a tragic slip, a story that would bury her as neatly as the snow already beginning to pile against her boots. As her numb fingers scraped against a sheer blue ice lens exposed by the wind's scouring breath, she felt not the paralyzing cold, but a shocking, crystalline potential. For the ice was not uniform, it was layered with millennia of compressed snow. And this particular face was dense and clear, a frozen window into deep time that was colder than the air itself. And yet it was solid. It was windproof, and it was abundant. The very substance of her death, this mountain of ancient winter, could be her shelter. A realization that arrived not as a hope, but as a stark command from some deep, stubborn core that refused to become their tragic footnote. And so she understood with a clarity that cut through the panic. She would not dig in. For to dig a snow cave in this debris field of ice boulders was to invite collapse and burial. And she would not simply huddle, for that was merely to choose a slower, more passive end. She would build out, using the glacier's own bones, and as she placed her palm flat against the blue wall, she made a promise to the storm. Her voice a raw whisper lost in the scream of the world. You will not have me. The decision crystallized in that moment of contact. A plan forming not as a series of steps, but as a single, a desperate image. A hollowed space within the ice itself, a negative of her own body carved from the heart of the moraine. And she knew the tools were already in her hands. For she carried the small, heavy miner's pick, meant for sampling quartz veins. And in her pocket, the broad-bladed skinning knife her father called an Arkansas toothpick. And these would be her chisels, her gouges, her means of negotiation with this frozen kingdom. She turned from the open expanse, the suicidal vastness of the whiteout, and faced the stacked chaos of the moraine, seeing it anew not as a tomb of rubble, but as a quarry of raw, architectural material, a library of ice types. The cloudy white ice that was softer, granular like a frozen sandstone, and the profound blue lenses that were diamond hard and clear as polished glass, and the dirty, sediment-laced bands that might provide insulation. Her shelter would need a low entrance to trap the heavier cold air, a raised sleeping bench to lift her from the chill that settled like water, and walls thick enough to mute the hurricane to a distant sigh. And she began to move along the ice face, her body a hunched question mark against the wind. searching for the right site. A place where the ice met the lee of a massive granite erratic to break the direct force of the storm, and where the ice formation was deep enough to allow her to carve inward without breaching the other side into another howling void. Her gloved hands, already stiff and aching, found a promising recess in the Moraine's face, a natural alcove where centuries of melt and shifting rock had sculpted a shallow depression in a monolith of the granular white ice. And she drove the pick's point into it with a two-handed swing that sent a shock up her arms and a shower of crystalline chips stinging against her cheek. And the first blow was a declaration of war against the mountain itself. A tiny, defiant percussion against the orchestra of the gale. She worked with a frantic, rhythmic fury, the pick rising and falling in a short, efficient arc. Each impact a thock that vibrated through the ice and into the bones of her wrists. And the initial cavity grew, not into a hole, but into a wound. A raw, jagged mouth that began to exhale the ancient, trapped cold of the glacier. A breath that felt older than stone. The physical toll was immediate and brutal, a fire in her shoulders and back that competed with the external cold, her breath sawing in and out in ragged plumes that froze instantly on the wool scarf wrapped over her nose, forming an icy mask that cracked and reformed with every gasp. And the sweat that sprang from her brow and spine was a traitorous betrayal, instantly chilling her core and making her shiver violently even as she swung again and again and again. The wind, thwarted by the erratic at her back, still found her, coiling around the edge of the granite to snatch at her coat and lash her with driven snow that began to accumulate in the nascent hollow, forcing her to stop and sweep it out with her arms in frantic, time-consuming motions. A race against the storm's relentless filling of any void she created. The entrance tunnel was the first trial, a low, crawling passage she had to carve by kneeling on the ice, her body bent double, the pick work now constrained and awkward, the ice fragments pelting her neck and finding their way inside her collar to melt and freeze again against her skin in a cycle of exquisite torment. And as the tunnel deepened, the world narrowed to the circle of ice before her face. The rhythm of her blows and the terrifying compression of the mountain's weight above her. A weight she could feel in the silence that began to gather behind her. A muffling of the storm's scream that was more ominous than the noise itself. She switched to the skinning knife when the pick became too unwieldy in the tight space, using its strong, flat blade to scrape and pare and smooth, to undercut a lip for a cold sink. And the slower, more deliberate work was its own kind of agony. A meticulous sculpting under duress, where every slip could mean a sliced glove or a ruined tool. Her fingers clenched around the bone handle until they cramped into claws, the knife scraping with a high, grating whine that set her teeth on edge. The darkness began to gather as she hollowed out the main chamber, a space just large enough to sit up in, and the fading light from the entrance tunnel, a dim, blue-gray slit, seemed to be swallowed by the ice itself. The walls glowing with a faint, internal luminescence that did nothing to illuminate, only to deepen the shadows. And she worked more by touch than by sight, feeling for inconsistencies, for cracks, for the dreaded soft spot that could mean a hidden fissure or a dangerously thin wall. The cold within the ice cave was different from the wind's assault. It was a profound, penetrating stillness that seeped up from the floor and reached from the walls with invisible hands. A cold that seemed to actively draw the heat from her marrow. And she realized, with a spike of raw panic, that her frantic labor was the only thing keeping her from freezing solid. That the moment she stopped moving, this sculpted tomb would begin its final work on her. A section of the ceiling, a lens of the clear blue ice, gave a sudden, sharp crack like a pistol shot, and she froze, heart hammering against her ribs, eyes straining upward, waiting for the collapse, for the crushing verdict of the mountain. But only a fine powder of ice sifted down, glittering in the gloom. And the silence that followed was heavier than the noise, a held breath from the earth itself. She continued, but every swing was now haunted. Every scrape of the knife a potential trigger. Her ears straining for the subtlest groan or shift, the architecture of her shelter feeling less like a creation and more like a temporary stay of execution. A fragile bubble of air in a solid, frozen sea that could reclaim its territory at any moment. The storm outside reached a new crescendo, a shrieking fury that made the very air vibrate. And though the walls muted it to a deep, rushing roar, she could feel the pressure changes in her ears, a popping and fullness that spoke of titanic forces playing just inches from her back. And a draft, knife-cold and insistent, began to snake through the entrance tunnel, telling her the wind had found her doorway and was now probing, searching for the warmth within. She had to fashion a door, a plug, and she used the pick to quarry a rough block of the softer white ice from the chamber wall, wrestling the heavy, awkward slab to the tunnel mouth, her body screaming in protest as she maneuvered it into place, only to find it was too large, and she had to carve it down, the knife scraping and chipping in the near dark, her time and heat bleeding away with every second, until finally, with a last grinding shove, the block sealed the entrance slit, plunging her into absolute, utter blackness. A blackness so complete it felt solid, a weight on her eyes, and the sound of the storm became a distant, mournful threnody, as if she were already buried. The silence inside was now absolute, broken only by the ragged hurricane of her own breathing and the pounding of her heart in her ears. A drumbeat of solitary life in a mineral stillness. And the cold, no longer fought by exertion, began its final, insidious advance, creeping through the layers of wool and leather, seeking the core of her. And she knew the next phase. The stillness would be the hardest trial of all, for she had carved her refuge, but in doing so, she had also carved her own coffin. And the difference between the two would be measured only in degrees and in the fragile, dwindling fire of her own will. But the stillness, when it came, was not the simple, biting cold she had braced for. It was something else entirely, a new and eerie danger that rose from the very walls of her sanctuary, a paradox she had not foreseen. For the ice itself began to breathe, not with warmth, but with a deeper, radiant cold. A cold that did not blow, but instead seeped, a palpable leaching of heat directly from her skin, as if the frozen air around her had become 1,000 tiny, hungry mouths. It was the cold of deep space, of absolute zero. And it presented a silent, invisible threat. Ice burn where touching the very walls that shielded her would strip the flesh from her bones in an instant, and paradoxical hypothermia, where her own shivering would cease not from warmth, but because her core was cooling so efficiently in the still, dry air that her body would simply surrender, drifting into a fatal sleep without a fight. The shelter, perfect in its wind-breaking geometry, had become a thermodynamic trap, drawing her heat out into the glacier's immense, ancient body with terrifying efficiency. And the eerie blue glow that now seemed to emanate from the ice around her was not a trick of the light, for there was no light, but a trick of her dying mind, a prelude to the final hallucinations. She realized, with a dread that was colder than the ice, that she was not in a refuge at all, but in the belly of the cold itself. And her greatest enemy was no longer the storm outside, but the profound, patient stillness within. A stillness that whispered for her to close her eyes, to rest, to let the beautiful blue light swallow her whole. Because the fight was over, and the glacier had won. In that moment, her prison transformed. The walls no longer mere barriers, but a text, a map, a material with intention. And she saw not a monolithic enemy, but a substance with grain and flow and fracture lines. A crystalline architecture waiting for a collaborator. She pressed her mittened hand, not in defeat, but in interrogation against the wall. And she felt it. A subtle vibration, a resonance from the storm screaming over the moraine outside, and a deep hum traveling through the glacier's body. And she understood the ice was not still. It was singing, a bass note of immense pressure and moving time. And her shelter was not a static tomb, but a living chamber within a living, flowing entity. The cold leeching her heat was not malice, but a conversation, an exchange of energy as fundamental as breath. And her task was not to defeat it, but to join it, to find the balance point where her tiny pulse of warmth could exist in equilibrium with that infinite cold, not by fighting, but by shaping the conversation. She took her dead husband's hunting knife from her belt, its steel biting into the ice, not as an attack, but as a question. And as the first curl of ice shavings spiraled to the floor, she began to listen with her whole being, her cuts becoming slower, more deliberate, following not a plan, but a feeling, carving a shallow, spiraling groove along the wall, a channel to guide the heavier, colder air that pooled around her ankles to sink down and away. And then another, higher up, to invite a whisper of the slightly less frigid air from the shelter's peak to descend and mix. She was not building, but sculpting, not constructing, but tuning. Her knife adjusting the shelter's interior contours with the precision of a luthier shaping a violin's chamber. Her entire world reduced to the feedback between her skin and the ice. The minute changes in how the air felt against her cheek, telling her where to carve next, until she was working in a kind of trance, a dialogue without words, where the ice suggested a curve and her hand answered, where a faint crackle inside the wall warned her of a stress point, and she relieved it with a graceful paring cut. She carved a small niche for the candle, deepening the back wall at a specific angle so that its meager glow reflected not off a flat surface, but off a faceted, prismatic hollow that multiplied the light into a constellation of blue and gold stars across the ceiling, and the heat from that single flame, now captured and reflected, began to pool gently around her shoulders. She sculpted the sleeping ledge into a shallow bowl, cradling her body, and the cold from the glacier beneath her seemed to flow around the curve of it rather than sinking directly into her bones. Time lost all meaning, measured only in the soft scratch of steel on ice and the gradual, miraculous shift in the quality of the air around her, which stopped stealing her heat and began to hold a fragile, stable layer of it close to her skin. A personal atmosphere she had carved into existence. The profound silence became a medium she could hear through. The deep hum of the glacier, a companion, and the eerie blue glow resolved into a genuine, beautiful luminescence. The ice capturing and diffusing the candlelight into the soft, holy light of a cathedral. She was not hiding from the glacier, she was communing with it. Her shelter no longer a hole in the ice, but an organ of the ice itself, a chamber shaped by a human heartbeat to sustain a human heartbeat. And in that moment of exhausted, awestruck understanding, curled in her sculpted cradle under a ceiling of captured starlight, Alara felt a peace deeper than any she had known in the world of sun and grass. For she had not outwitted the mountain, but had spoken its language, and the mountain, in its ancient, indifferent way, had answered. The blizzard's fury became a distant, irrelevant thing, a tantrum on the surface, while here, in the heart of the ice, there was only this profound, silent partnership, this perfectly balanced cold, this shelter that was less a thing she made and more a thing she and the glacier had made together. And then as she drifted into a true, restorative sleep, she knew the storm would end and she would walk out. But part of her, the part that now understood the song of deep time and the architecture of cold, would remain here forever, in the graceful, life-giving curves of the ice. But the peace was a lie, or at least it was temporary, because the storm did end, and its ending was not the triumph she imagined, not a door swinging open to freedom, but something far more terrifying. The silence returned, but this was a different silence entirely, not the deep, resonant hum of the glacier's heart, but a total, suffocating void, the absence of the very wind that had been her enemy. And in that absence, the true scale of her predicament descended upon her with a weight more crushing than any ice. The blizzard had been a furious, living thing, a force to be measured and opposed. But this new silence was the sound of the world having finished with her. The sound of a page turned, of a story concluded without her consent. And she realized, with a cold spike of panic that had nothing to do with the temperature, that she was now buried, not just sheltered, but interred under tons of settled snow and debris. And the storm had sculpted over her hidden door. The cathedral glow of her chamber now felt like a tomb's phosphorescence. The graceful curves of her walls, the final, beautiful boundaries of a prison she had carved with her own hands, and the awe she felt curdled into a profound, isolating dread. Because survival had required her to go so deep, to become so perfectly a part of the ice, that the world above might now be impossible to reach. She pressed her ear to the wall, listening for any whisper of the wind she had cursed, any proof of an outside. But there was only the thick, cottony nothing of immense, packed snow, and the single, hammering beat of her own heart, which now seemed like the only living sound left on the mountain. She knew, with a certainty that settled deeper than the cold, that the ice would not release her gently, that this final negotiation would demand everything the storm had not already taken. And so she began not with frantic clawing, but with a slow, deliberate mapping of her tomb, her palms reading the walls she had shaped, searching for the memory of the entrance, for the subtle weakness where her own body had last passed from one world into this one. Her fingers found the seam, a hairline fracture in the artistry, and she pressed her forehead against it, not in prayer, but in conference, as if the glacier might yet remember their pact. And then she took the last of her strength, the reserve she had kept for this moment alone, and she began to carve her way out, not with the broad, sweeping gestures of creation, but with the focused, agonizing precision of a miner following the thinnest vein of hope. Each handful of impacted snow and granular ice was a victory measured in ounces. Each inch gained a monumental expenditure of will, her breath coming in ragged clouds that froze instantly on her lashes and the wool of her hood, building a second, brittle mask over her face as she worked. Time dissolved into the rhythm of scrape and pull, of burning muscle and screaming joint, the world narrowing to the dark tunnel forming before her. A passage so tight her shoulders brushed the walls, a birth canal of ice that demanded she shed all pride, all thought, until she was nothing but a persistent, animal insistence moving against the mountain's weight. The air grew thick and stale, tasting of her own exhaustion, and a new fear bloomed, not of the cold, but of suffocation within this self-made passage. And she had to force herself to slow, to carve small ventilation shafts upward with trembling fingers, a blind gardener tending to an invisible root, trusting that somewhere above, air still moved. For hours that felt like days, she persisted. Her universe, the crunch of her tool and the feel of ice grains against her raw skin, the occasional disorienting slide of debris from above, reminding her of the precarious mountain resting on her back. Until at last, her probing hand met not more resistance, but a sudden, yielding softness, a different quality of cold, and she dug with a final, desperate surge, breaking through into a blinding, painful, glorious whiteness.